Listen carefully, because this is something most people misunderstand when it comes to relationships, especially when you're dealing with someone who pulls away, goes silent, comes back, and confuses your entire emotional world. An avoidant person doesn't just not care. They often care deeply, but they fear closeness more than they fear losing you. And that creates a pattern that can either break you or build you into a stronger, more grounded human being. Now, here's the first big sign you should keep trying. They don't disappear completely. An avoidant who is truly done will vanish without emotional residue. But if they keep circling back, checking in, or finding small reasons to stay connected, it means something inside them still sees value in you. Not full access, not full vulnerability, but a thread of emotional attachment that hasn't been cut. And that thread is not something to ignore. It's something to understand with patience, not panic. The second sign is even more powerful, their actions showing consistency, not indifference. When someone doesn't care, they are consistently absent. But an avoidant fluctuates, warm one moment, distant the next. That push and pull is not randomness, it's internal conflict. They want connection, but they fear losing themselves in it. And if you see that pattern, you are not dealing with a closed door. You are dealing with a locked door that opens under emotional safety, not pressure. But listen closely, because this is where most people make a mistake. They chase harder when they feel distance. They over-text, over-explain, over-give. And what happens? The avoidant retreats further, not because you are wrong, but because their nervous system reads intensity as danger. So the real question is not, should I try harder? The real question is, can I stay grounded enough to create safety instead of pressure? The third sign you should keep trying is subtle but real. They show vulnerability in small cracks. Maybe they admit something personal late at night. Maybe they express fear, regret, or confusion about relationships. Maybe they say, I'm not good at this. These are not excuses. They are signals. Avoidants don't open up easily. So when they do, even briefly, it means they trust you more than they trust most people. And trust, even in fragments, is the beginning of emotional bridge building. But here is the truth that separates emotional strength from emotional dependency. You cannot love someone into healing. You can only create an environment where healing feels safe. If you are constantly anxious, constantly waiting, constantly over-invested, you are not building love. You are building pressure. And pressure pushes avoidant people away every single time, no matter how strong the connection is. The fourth sign is progress over time, not perfection in moments. If the distance slowly reduces, if communication becomes slightly more consistent, if they start initiating even in small ways, that is movement. And movement matters more than intensity, because avoidant attachment patterns don't change in emotional explosions. They change in repeated safe experiences. Consistency is more powerful than emotional speeches. But now I need you to hear something that will protect your self-respect. Trying is only healthy if you are also growing. If you are losing yourself, if your confidence is collapsing, if your emotional stability depends entirely on their next message, then you are not trying, you are attaching. And attachment without boundaries turns love into anxiety. The final truth is this: the BIG sign you should keep trying is not about them alone. It's about you. If you can stay calm, patient, grounded, and self-respecting while still showing care, then you are not chasing, you are building. But if the relationship turns you into someone you don't recognize, then the lesson is not to try harder. It is to step back and rebuild yourself first. Because real love does not demand the loss of self. And real connection does not require emotional suffering as proof of loyalty. The strongest version of you doesn't beg, doesn't chase, and doesn't collapse under uncertainty. The strongest version of you understands this: if it's meant to grow, it will grow in clarity, not confusion. So keep trying only if it is building you, not breaking you. Because the goal is never to win someone who avoids love. The goal is to become someone who no longer loses themselves in it. When you deal with someone who has an avoidant attachment style, the biggest misunderstanding is assuming they don't feel deeply. In reality, many avoidant people feel more than they can handle. Their emotional world is often active, sensitive, and complex. But the moment things start getting too close, too real, or too emotionally exposing, something inside them pulls back. It is not the absence of love that drives them away. It is the fear of what love demands from them emotionally. For an avoidant person, emotional closeness doesn't always feel safe. Instead of experiencing intimacy as comfort, they often experience it as pressure or even emotional risk. When someone starts depending on them, expecting consistency, or asking for deeper emotional availability, their internal system reacts as if their independence is being threatened. So they retreat, not because they don't care, but because closeness triggers discomfort they don't fully understand or control. This is where most relationships get misinterpreted. The partner on the receiving end often thinks, if they love me, they would stay close. But for an avoidant individual, love and closeness are not always aligned. They can love someone and still feel the urge to step back. They can miss someone and still avoid contact. It creates confusion for both sides, but inside their mind, distance becomes a way to regulate emotional intensity, not a rejection of feelings. At times, avoidant individuals may even surprise you with moments of warmth, affection, or emotional openness. These moments are real, but they are often followed by withdrawal. It is not manipulation, it is emotional overload. When vulnerability reaches a certain point, their instinct is to restore balance by creating space again. This cycle can make their behavior feel unpredictable, but underneath it is a consistent pattern of protecting emotional boundaries. What makes this dynamic even more complicated is that avoidant people often don't consciously realize why they pull away. They may rationalize it as needing space, focusing on work, or being busy, but underneath those explanations is a deeper discomfort with emotional dependence. They are not trying to hurt anyone. They are trying to feel safe in a situation that feels too emotionally intense for their internal wiring at that moment. Understanding this changes everything about how you respond. Instead of interpreting distance as lack of care, you begin to see it as a coping mechanism for emotional overwhelm. It doesn't mean you tolerate inconsistency without boundaries, but it does help you stop personalizing every withdrawal. Because in many cases, the avoidant person isn't running away from you specifically, they are running from the intensity of emotional closeness itself. When someone has an avoidant pattern, their distance can feel confusing, but one of the most important things to observe is what they do instead of complete disappearance. Because when a person is truly emotionally detached, they don't stay connected in any form. They don't check in, they don't reappear, and they don't leave traces of presence behind. So when an avoidant person keeps coming back in small ways, it often reveals that something inside them is still emotionally tied, even if they struggle to express it clearly. This partial presence is not random. It usually shows up in subtle behaviors, sending a message after days of silence, reacting to something you posted, or finding small excuses to reconnect without fully engaging. To an outside observer, it may look inconsistent, but psychologically it reflects a push and pull dynamic. One part of them wants distance to feel safe, while another part still feels connected enough to re-enter your space. That tension creates a cycle of retreat and return. What makes this pattern so powerful is that true emotional disconnection doesn't leave room for return. When someone is fully done, their energy closes completely. There is no hesitation, no curiosity, no re-entry. But when someone keeps orbiting your life in irregular intervals, it suggests that the emotional bond hasn't been fully resolved. It may be suppressed, controlled, or buried under fear, but it still exists beneath the surface. For the person on the receiving end, this can create emotional confusion. You start questioning what their behavior really means because their presence is not consistent enough to feel secure, yet not absent enough to feel final. That in-between space is where most emotional overthinking begins. But if you look closely, that in-between space is often where unresolved attachment lives, not indifference. Avoidant individuals, in particular, don't always process emotional detachment in a clean or linear way. Instead of cutting ties completely, they tend to create distance while still maintaining a minimal emotional thread. That thread allows them to feel in control while still not fully letting go. It is their way of managing attachment without feeling overwhelmed by it, even if it appears confusing from the outside. So when someone doesn't fully disappear, it is worth recognizing that emotional attachment may still be active, even if it is not expressed in a stable or healthy way. The inconsistency itself becomes evidence that something still exists between distance and connection, even if it is not yet strong enough to become stable intimacy. When someone shows hot and cold behavior, it can feel emotionally exhausting because you never know where you stand with them. One moment they are warm, engaged, and emotionally available, and the next moment they pull away as if a switch has been turned off. But this pattern is rarely about complete lack of interest. Instead, it often reveals a deeper internal struggle where two opposing emotional forces are pulling the person in different directions at the same time. On one side, there is the part of them that wants connection. This is the side that reaches out, opens up, laughs with you, and feels emotionally present. It is real in those moments. But on the other side, there is a protective instinct that activates when things start feeling too close or too intense. That part says, this is getting too vulnerable, and immediately creates distance as a form of emotional safety. The conflict between these two states creates the inconsistency you experience. This is why hot and cold behavior should not always be interpreted as manipulation or lack of care. In many cases, it is emotional dysregulation. The person is not fully stable in how they handle closeness, so their behavior changes depending on what emotional state they are in at that moment. When they feel safe, they lean in. When they feel overwhelmed, they pull back. It is less about you and more about how they process emotional intensity internally. For the person on the receiving end, this pattern can be deeply confusing because it creates hope and disappointment in cycles. You start to believe things are improving when they are warm, and then you question everything when they suddenly withdraw. This emotional fluctuation can make you overanalyze every interaction, trying to find a logical explanation for something that is actually driven by emotional conflict rather than logic. What makes this even more complex is that avoidant or emotionally conflicted individuals often don't consciously realize the pattern they are repeating. They may genuinely feel close in one moment and then feel the urge to retreat in the next, without fully understanding why the shift happens so quickly. It is not a calculated decision. It is an automatic emotional response to perceived closeness or vulnerability. So when you see inconsistency, it is important to understand that it often reflects a divided internal state rather than a clear decision to not care. The connection is still there in moments, but it is constantly being challenged by fear, discomfort, or emotional overload, which creates the cycle of approaching and withdrawing that defines hot and cold behavior. When you feel someone slipping away, the natural human reaction is to move closer, to try harder, to explain more, to prove your value, and to do everything possible to restore the connection. But in relationships where an avoidant attachment pattern is present, this instinct often backfires in ways that feel painful and confusing. What feels like effort and love from your side can be experienced as pressure from theirs, and that shift changes everything in the emotional dynamic. For an avoidant individual, emotional pressure is not always about words or demands. It is about intensity. When someone starts chasing harder, sending repeated messages, seeking reassurance, or trying to fix the emotional distance quickly, it increases the perceived emotional weight of the connection. Instead of feeling drawn in, the avoidant mind begins to feel cornered. And when emotional space feels reduced, the instinct is not to come closer, but to step back further. This reaction is not because they don't care, but because their internal system associates closeness with loss of control. The more someone pushes for clarity or emotional response, the more it activates their need for distance. It creates a silent alarm inside them that says, I need space to regulate myself. So even if they had moments of connection before, the increased pressure can override those feelings temporarily and push them into withdrawal mode. From your perspective, it can feel unfair because your intention is connection, not control. You are trying to save something that feels like it is fading. But in avoidant dynamics, emotional intensity often does not translate into emotional security. Instead, it can feel overwhelming, especially if the person already struggles with managing closeness. What feels like closeness to you can feel like suffocation to them, even if your intentions are pure. The painful cycle begins when chasing leads to more distance. And that distance triggers even more chasing. It becomes a loop where both sides are reacting emotionally, but in opposite directions. The more you try to pull them in, the more they feel the need to step out. This is not because the connection is fake, but because the nervous systems on both sides are responding differently to emotional stress. Understanding this pattern does not mean suppressing your feelings or pretending not to care. It means recognizing that pressure rarely creates connection with someone who associates closeness with discomfort. In many cases, stepping back slightly, not out of punishment, but out of emotional grounding, creates more room for natural reconnection than chasing ever could. When it comes to avoidant attachment patterns, one of the most misunderstood ideas is the belief that stronger emotions automatically create stronger connection. In reality, for someone who struggles with emotional closeness, intensity can feel overwhelming rather than inviting. What actually begins to soften their walls is not dramatic emotional expression, but a sense of safety, an environment where they don't feel pressured, judged, or emotionally cornered. Safety becomes the doorway, while intensity often becomes the barrier. Emotional safety is created in small, consistent signals rather than big emotional gestures. It is the feeling that they are not going to be punished for needing space, not going to be chased aggressively when they withdraw, and not going to be forced into emotional conversations before they are ready. When an avoidant person senses that they can come close without losing control of their emotional independence, their nervous system slowly starts to relax. And relaxation is what allows connection to grow naturally. Intensity, on the other hand, often triggers the opposite response. Even if the emotions are loving and sincere, too much emotional urgency can feel like pressure. It can show up as constant reassurance, seeking repeated emotional conversations, or attempts to speed up closeness. While these actions may come from care, they can overwhelm someone who already associates intimacy with emotional risk. Instead of opening up, they instinctively retreat to regain balance and distance. What makes emotional safety so powerful is that it removes the feeling of emotional demand. The avoidant person begins to understand, often without words, that connection does not require them to abandon their comfort zone or rush their emotional process. This creates internal permission to engage at their own pace. And for someone who is used to protecting their independence, that permission is what slowly lowers resistance. Over time, this steady and non-threatening environment allows small moments of openness to appear. It may start with brief honesty, a slightly longer conversation, or sharing something personal that would normally be held back. These moments are not random. They are the result of feeling safe enough to take emotional risks without fear of being overwhelmed or trapped in intensity. In the long run, it is not emotional force that builds deeper connection with avoidant individuals, but emotional consistency paired with calm presence. When the nervous system stops associating closeness with pressure, space begins to open for genuine vulnerability. And that vulnerability does not appear because it was demanded, but because it finally felt safe enough to exist. When someone who is naturally guarded starts sharing small pieces of their inner world, it should never be overlooked. These moments may seem simple on the surface: a short confession, a late night message, or an unexpected admission of fear or regret. But in reality, they carry deep emotional weight. For a person who usually protects their emotions, even a small act of openness is a significant step beyond their comfort zone. And it signals that trust is beginning to form in a quiet but meaningful way. Vulnerability does not always appear in grand emotional speeches. In fact, with avoidant individuals, it rarely does. Instead, it shows up in fragments, small sentences that reveal more than they intended, brief moments where their emotional guard slips, or subtle honesty that breaks their usual pattern of distance. These moments are important because they represent a temporary lowering of internal defenses, something they don't easily allow with just anyone. When someone shares their fears, even in a limited way, it means they are beginning to feel that their emotions will not be judged or rejected. Fear is one of the most protected parts of any human being, especially for those who struggle with emotional closeness. So when that fear is spoken aloud, even briefly, it shows that the person is testing emotional safety. They are silently asking, can I be seen like this without losing connection? Regret is another powerful form of vulnerability. When someone admits mistakes or reflects on past emotional decisions, it reveals self-awareness and a willingness to be emotionally exposed. For avoidant individuals, this is not easy because it requires them to step outside their protective distance and acknowledge feelings they might normally suppress. Even a small admission of regret can be a sign that emotional walls are softening, even if only slightly. These moments often pass quickly, and that is why they are so easily underestimated. After opening up, the person may retreat again, not because the vulnerability was fake, but because it felt unfamiliar or too exposing. This cycle of brief openness, followed by withdrawal, is not rejection, it is regulation. They open a small door, then close it to feel safe again. But the fact that the door opens at all is what matters. Over time, if these small moments continue to appear, they form a pattern that signals growing trust. It is not about intensity or frequency alone, but about willingness. Each small act of emotional honesty becomes a brick in the foundation of connection, showing that even someone who struggles with closeness is slowly beginning to feel safe enough to let another person see pieces of their inner world. When you care deeply about someone who struggles with emotional availability, it is easy to fall into the belief that if you just try harder, love stronger, explain better, or stay more patient, they will eventually open up. It feels logical in the moment, as if your consistency could become the key that unlocks their emotional world. But emotional healing does not work like a locked door that opens through effort from the outside. It is an internal process that no amount of external pressure can replace. True emotional availability is something that develops from within a person, usually through their own awareness, reflection, and willingness to face discomfort. You can create a safe environment, you can show consistency, and you can offer understanding, but you cannot do the inner work on their behalf. If someone is not ready to confront their own fears around closeness, no amount of love or effort from another person can bypass that internal resistance. What often happens in these situations is that one person starts over investing emotionally, believing they are helping the other person heal through patience and persistence. But instead of creating growth, this dynamic can create imbalance. The more one person gives, the more the other person may retreat if they are not emotionally ready. This creates a cycle where effort increases, but emotional connection does not necessarily deepen in the same proportion. It is also important to understand that emotional availability is not just about behavior, it is about capacity. Some people may want closeness, but do not yet have the emotional tools to sustain it. When they feel overwhelmed, they pull back, not because they are being difficult, but because their internal system is trying to protect them from emotional overload. In such cases, trying to force openness can actually make them feel more unsafe, not more connected. This is where many people experience frustration because effort feels like it should equal progress. But in emotional healing, timing matters just as much as intention. If someone is not internally ready, even the most genuine love can feel like pressure to them. And pressure rarely leads to openness. It usually leads to withdrawal, confusion, or emotional shutdown. At the deepest level, understanding this truth shifts your focus from trying to change someone to recognizing what is and is not within your control. You can influence the environment, you can express care, and you can show stability, but the decision to heal, grow, and become emotionally available has to come from the other person's own willingness to face themselves. When it comes to emotional growth and relationships, one of the biggest mistakes people make is expecting instant transformation. We often imagine that real change should look dramatic, sudden clarity, immediate consistency, and perfect emotional balance. But in reality, progress rarely arrives in a straight line. It comes quietly in small shifts that are easy to overlook if you are only searching for perfection instead of movement. Small steps toward consistency often carry more truth than occasional big gestures. Someone might not suddenly become fully emotionally available or perfectly stable, but they might start responding a little faster, opening up slightly more, or staying engaged for longer periods than before. These subtle changes may not feel impressive in the moment, but they represent something important, the beginning of emotional alignment that did not exist before. Progress in human behavior is often uneven. There are moments of closeness followed by distance, moments of understanding followed by confusion. Instead of seeing these fluctuations as failure, they can be understood as part of the adjustment process. Emotional habits, especially those tied to attachment and vulnerability, do not change overnight. They shift gradually as a person becomes more familiar with safety and connection over time. What makes small progress so powerful is that it reflects effort against resistance. When someone begins to show even slightly more consistency, it often means they are pushing against their own internal patterns. That resistance could be fear, habit, or emotional discomfort. So even a minor change is not minor in its origin. It is a sign that something inside them is starting to move in a new direction. At the same time, focusing only on perfection can create disappointment that hides real growth. If you are only looking for complete stability, you may miss the fact that things are actually improving in subtle ways. This can lead to frustration, even when progress is happening right in front of you. Recognizing small steps helps you stay grounded in reality instead of chasing an ideal that may not yet be possible. Over time, these small, consistent actions begin to build a pattern. And patterns are what eventually shape trust, stability, and emotional security. What starts as minor improvements can gradually evolve into stronger connection, not because everything became perfect overnight, but because steady progress was recognized, respected, and allowed to develop naturally without being dismissed as not enough. When you start caring deeply about someone, it is natural to think about them often, to replay conversations in your mind, and to try to understand what their behavior means. But there is a turning point where thinking turns into overthinking and care turns into anxiety. That shift is subtle at first. You begin checking your phone more often, analyzing small changes in tone, and searching for hidden meaning in silence that may not even be intentional. Anxiety in a relationship does not appear suddenly. It builds gradually when emotional clarity is missing. When someone is inconsistent, distant, or unpredictable, your mind tries to fill in the gaps with explanations. You start creating stories in your head to make sense of confusion, but instead of bringing peace, those stories often create more fear. The more uncertain the connection feels, the more your thoughts begin to spiral. Over time, you may notice that your emotional state is no longer stable. Your mood starts depending on their messages, their replies, or their level of attention. A simple delay in response can shift your entire emotional energy. This is where the relationship stops being just a connection and starts becoming a source of internal tension. Instead of feeling grounded, You feel like you are constantly waiting for something to stabilize. What makes this even more draining is that overthinking creates a loop. You think to find certainty, but the thinking itself creates more uncertainty. You question your worth, their intentions, and the future of the connection repeatedly. This mental cycle does not lead to clarity. It leads to exhaustion. And the more exhausted you become, the more emotionally dependent you feel on external reassurance. A healthy connection does not require constant mental decoding. There is space for calm, for predictability, and for emotional ease. But when you find yourself constantly analyzing, rereading messages, or searching for hidden meaning in every interaction, it is a signal that your emotional nervous system is under strain. Your mind is no longer in a state of connection. It is in a state of survival, trying to protect you from uncertainty. At its core, losing yourself in anxiety and overthinking is not just about the other person. It is about how your emotional balance is being affected. When a relationship starts to consume your peace more than it adds to it, when your thoughts become heavier than your joy, and when clarity is replaced by constant mental noise, it reflects a dynamic that is no longer emotionally supportive for your inner stability. When you are emotionally invested in someone, especially in a situation where clarity is not always consistent, the real challenge is not just about how much you care, it is about how well you can remain stable within yourself while caring. The strongest approach in any emotional dynamic is not losing yourself in the process of connection. It is about staying grounded, where your thoughts, emotions, and actions are not completely controlled by the other person's behavior. Being grounded means you do not let temporary shifts in someone's attention or mood completely shift your internal state. You may feel things deeply, but you do not abandon your sense of balance because of uncertainty. Instead of reacting immediately to every change, you pause internally and maintain awareness of your own emotional center. This creates a sense of stability that protects you from emotional extremes. Self-respect becomes the foundation of this strength. It means you do not overextend yourself just to keep someone interested, nor do you chase validation at the cost of your peace. You understand your own value is not defined by how consistently someone else responds to you. When self-respect is strong, you naturally stop accepting situations that repeatedly disturb your emotional well-being, even if your feelings are still involved. Emotional independence is another layer of this approach. It does not mean you stop caring or detach completely. It means your emotional stability does not depend entirely on another person's actions. You are capable of feeling happy, calm, and complete within yourself, even when the other person is distant or inconsistent. This reduces emotional dependency and prevents you from entering cycles of anxiety or overthinking. When you engage with someone from this place of groundedness, self-respect, and emotional independence, your presence becomes different. You are no longer chasing or overreaching. Instead, you are interacting from a position of balance. This changes the dynamic because you are not reacting out of fear or insecurity, but responding with clarity and emotional control. At a deeper level, this approach protects your identity. It ensures that while you may care about someone, you do not lose yourself in the process of trying to maintain connection. You remain aware of your own emotional limits, your own worth, and your own peace, making sure that no relationship becomes the reason you disconnect from yourself. In the end, everything comes down to one simple but powerful realization: emotional connection should never cost you your inner stability. Whether you are dealing with someone who is avoidant, inconsistent, or emotionally complex, the real lesson is not to lose yourself in the attempt to hold on to them. Because the moment your peace becomes dependent on someone else's behavior, you are no longer in a relationship of balance. You are in a cycle of emotional instability that slowly drains your clarity, confidence, and self-worth. True emotional strength is not shown by how much you can endure confusion or how long you can wait in uncertainty. It is shown by how grounded you remain while everything around you feels uncertain. It is the ability to care without collapsing, to feel without falling apart, and to stay connected to your own identity, even when the other person is not fully consistent. This kind of strength does not come from chasing harder or trying to fix everything. It comes from knowing when to step back emotionally and observe instead of react. When you begin to value yourself deeply, your entire perspective on relationships shifts. You stop interpreting inconsistency as something you must solve and start recognizing it as something you must understand. You stop overextending yourself just to keep someone close and start asking whether the connection is also giving you emotional safety in return. Because real love is not measured by intensity alone. It is measured by how peaceful you feel within it. At the same time, this does not mean shutting your heart or becoming emotionally distant from others. It means learning how to stay open without becoming dependent, how to care without losing control of your emotions, and how to stay present without abandoning your self-respect. You can still love deeply, but that love should not come at the cost of your mental peace or identity. The healthiest connections are the ones where you remain whole, not the ones where you lose pieces of yourself to keep them alive. And perhaps the most important truth is this: the right connection does not require you to constantly question your worth, chase clarity, or fight for basic emotional stability. It feels steady, not chaotic. It brings understanding, not confusion. It gives space without creating fear. When you stay grounded, self-respecting, and emotionally independent, you naturally move closer to relationships that match your level of maturity, while stepping away from those that require you to shrink yourself to fit into uncertainty.